All right. Hello, everyone. I hope you're all doing well today. Thank you so much for tuning in to my channel, Read, Write, and Think with me, Aruni Mahapatra. I'm here today to talk about a book that I find very interesting, very useful, and also very important given the times in which we live. Here is the book. Let me try to show the cover on my iPad. This is Generous Thinking by Kathleen Fitzpatrick. Sorry about the glare. I don't quite. Okay, yeah, here it is. Generous Thinking by Kathleen Fitzpatrick. This book was published in the year 2019, but I think it's very relevant today, and I'll briefly talk about its general relevance and then talk a little bit about its personal relevance to me as the person that I am and given the job that I do. So, a couple of weeks ago in India, the NIRF rankings were published. As some of you may know, the NIRF stands for the National Institutional Rankings Framework. And understandably, once these results came out, there was a lot of media coverage. There were many front page articles in many English dailies. There were a lot of shows on primetime news channels, and a lot of people were happy. A lot of people were a little bit disappointed, uh, depending on how well their institutions had performed on these rankings. Uh, my own feelings were something of unease and discomfort. I remember feeling very disturbed at this kind of mad rush towards rankings. And the reason I felt that way is because I felt that this ranking was setting up a sense that we are all involved in this zero sum game, a version of the Hunger Games. And uh, Kathleen Fitzpatrick actually calls this race for excellence in which institutions are involved a kind of academic Hunger Games, right? So that's not entirely a joke. And that's the sense that I was getting from that news coverage, not the rankings themselves. Of course, they are done by perfectly sensible people in perfectly objective and scientific ways, but the implication that was being created through the media coverage, through the discussion, through the celebration, through all of the reactions that came out after the rankings were published, th- through those reactions and those celebrations, that implication was somehow being circulated, that there is a very limited amount of resources, whether it is the attention of students, whether it is the money that governments can give to institutes, or the money that private capitalists can invest, and so that they can get the best return on their investment, that there is a very limited amount of these resources, monetary or otherwise, and every institute is locked with every other institute in an endless competition. This was the discomforting and disturbing sense that I had. And I remembered reading in this book, Generous Thinking, Kathleen Fitzpatrick writing that competitive thinking is probably the most dangerous, the most pernicious thing that afflicts the higher education system today. So that's one very general reason for talking about this book. There's a personal reason for talking about this book as well. I recently finished my PhD in English literature and began my career as an assistant professor of English. Um, I care deeply about literature, and that's why I'm in this job. But there were many times in my professional training as a PhD student and also as a junior faculty when I felt and I do feel that the reason why I and many others like myself entered this profession, which is that we we all care deeply for literature and we enjoy talking about literature, teaching literature, and writing about literature. These experiences of joy were sometimes completely suppressed or replaced in our professional lives as scholars and teachers of literature. And they were replaced by something very different. And I describe it as a sometimes aggressive and at times even hostile attitude. What is that attitude? That attitude is one that places us in a position of power, in a dominant, powerful position with regard to literary texts, but also in relation to colleagues, in relation to students, and in relation to everyone outside our discipline. I don't like to inhabit that position of power. I am deeply uncomfortable in that position. And yet I find myself occupying that position. I have found myself occupying that position many times. And so it's a source of more than a little unease. And I've been struggling with that. So I was happy when I found this book, Kathleen Fitzpatrick's book, Generous Thinking, because it addresses that sense of discomfort, uh, consoles me and many others like myself, and points the way forward, right? So, very, very useful. If there are among you in the audience students who are just entering PhD programs or junior faculty or just anyone interested in uh, taking up a position in higher education or making the best of your position given that you're already in it, then this book is highly recommended. So, what is this book about? Now, the opening sentence, the very first sentence of the book declares uh, that the book explores some possibilities for rebuilding a relationship of trust between universities and the publics they are meant to serve. Right? I just want to pause a little bit and reflect and break down that sentence a little bit. So, several things are going on. One, um, the there is a problem to which this book is a response. The problem is that a relationship of trust, which should have been intact, is broken, is no longer intact, right? And that is a trust that should exist between universities and the publics they are meant to serve. Okay, that is one. That is generally speaking the problem. And then there is a solution or an attempt to put forward a sort of strategy to overcoming the problem, which the bulk of which consists this book. The uh, is the task that this book undertakes. So, how does Kathleen Fitzpatrick propose to rebuild that trust which has been eroded? Right. Uh, there are generally two parts to this approach. The first part is very, very conceptual, and the chapters that do the bulk of this conceptual work are chapters 1 and 4. Chapter 1 titled Generosity, and chapter 4 titled The University. The conceptual work that Fitzpatrick does in these chapters is to clarify what that trust should be, what that trust could be, what that trust was in, say, the imagination of the founders of the, say, the U.S. higher education system, and why that trust. is eroded or seems to be disappearing today. So a lot of historical work there, uh, work of the so the kind of work in these sections is about how the U.S. higher education system was created, what are the challenges it is facing today, and so on. But also a lot of analytical work because the erosion of trust, right, is happening not only from those who are outside the university or who are on top of the university, that is administrators, governments, policymakers, etc., etc. But sometimes, and in often unconscious ways, often despite their best intentions, that work of eroding the trust is also happening as a consequence of the things done by many people inside the university as well. And I'll speak a little bit about this in the second half of this video. Um, that part is very interesting to me, and that part Fitzpatrick does in a little bit in chapter one, generosity, but more in chapter two, which is reading. So, what is the nature of that conceptual and analytical work? Uh, Basically, Fitzpatrick describes how uh, a lot of academic work ends up alienating non-professional but sympathetic, intelligent, and curious audiences. Right. So the work that experts or professional readers and scholars do, instead of inviting non-professional but curious and interested readers, uh, ends up alienating those readers. So uh, that's the conceptual part, understanding what kind of trust universities should build, and why they are not building that trust, or why that trust is being eroded uh, through the kinds of decisions and policies and very wide public and social decisions being made by administrators, governments, etc., etc., and also some unconscious decisions and behaviors undertaken by professional experts within the university itself. So that's the conceptual part. And then there's a lot of practical part in which Fitzpatrick provides practical solutions, practical strategies that experts such as myself and many others in the audience of this video, I hope, can undertake in order to uh, put themselves in a position where their professional work as scholars and teachers does not deepen the divide between the university and non-expert audiences, but rather invites these non-expert but sympathetic and curious audiences to join them, that is, join us in the kind of expert research and technical work that we do. So that's a very nutshell summary of the book. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the conceptual work in chapter four, which is the university. I find that very useful because that speaks very directly to the kind of environment in which I find myself today. So I spoke a little bit about the NIRF rankings earlier, and this is the chapter in which Fitzpatrick explains why competitive thinking and being is probably the most dangerous thing that higher education professionals today can engage in. But Fitzpatrick's explanation and elaboration of this competitive thinking uh, begins with a kind of general social history and a very useful, for me at least, definition of public and private goods, right? So, very quickly, Fitzpatrick defines a public good as something that all of us have a right to access, which all of us need, and which all of us have a duty to help preserve, protect, and maintain, right? So just like clean water and air. Now, the technical economic terms for this kind of a public good are non-excludable and non-rivalrous, meaning no one can be excluded from accessing that public good, and non-rivalrous, meaning if one person or community accesses that good, it does not mean that there is less of it left for others. So these are the this is what a public good is. Now, we would think that knowledge, or at least access to knowledge, would be public goods, would fall in the general category of public goods. And Fitzpatrick explains how about maybe 5, 6, maybe 7 decades ago in the US, there was a dominant sense that that knowledge and access to knowledge should be public goods in this very sense. Uh, However, in the due to changes in government, but also in society, and it's not uh, Fitzpatrick's mandate to clarify exactly what sociological changes have produced that, but the result of those changes, and which we can perceive in the higher education landscape today, is that knowledge and access to knowledge is no longer seen as a kind of public good, right? So earlier it was possible for someone to believe in the US that a high quality education was was good for society at large. That if every citizen had access to a high quality education, that access, that ability to access, would be good for society at large, not just for that individual. Today, however, the dominant mode of thinking is that a high quality education is a private choice, meaning if I want a high quality education, I should do what is needed to get it. Or if I want my children to get a high quality education, I need to do what is needed to get it. I cannot expect the state to provide that, because in the US at least, that implies that someone else's resources are being utilized to fund my choices, right? So this is a kind of privatization of education. This is a mindset. Now, I find this to be a very powerful way of thinking, because in many aspects of higher education, that that privatized mentality persists. And one example that Fitzpatrick gives is this tendency to prioritize and reward and incentivize research that results in patents. Now, of course, we know that patents only favor certain disciplines, or certain disciplines are more likely to be able to get patents, but whereas in other disciplines, the production and circulation and evolution of disciplinary knowledge happens in modes other than patents, right? Uh, and just a very basic example would be philosophy and physics. And I'm not a philosopher or a physicist, so I apologize for butchering any concepts there. But my very non-expert sense is that uh, Plato is not outdated in the same way that maybe physicists of Plato's time are, right? So the evolution of knowledge in many humanist disciplines is cyclical and not linear, right? So we still read Shakespeare. It's not that our use of English is an evolved version of Shakespeare, or that we have evolved in our use of English to a point where Shakespeare's use of English is not relevant. It's not like that. It's cyclical. So just that kind of mentality, that why would patents be the sole criteria of measuring excellence in academic work? And this applies to other. This can be extended to other uh, tendencies in the way excellence is rewarded and recognized. Just one more example would be, uh, why do we why do governments and administrators and chancellors and people who run universities or owners or capitalist investors, why do they value those disciplines which lead to employment, which lead to direct employment more? Let's say professional degrees like engineering, management, or medicine. Why do these degrees earn more respect than those degrees like say a bachelor's in English, which does not lead to automatic or direct employment. Right? So these are all um, implications of that privatized mentality. Okay, so because it's hard for people to get an education, therefore they should be educated in those disciplines which help them get jobs. Right, so that there's that conceptual link there. Now, this kind of thinking, this kind of privatized mentality, which leads universities to offer students and the public the best bang for their buck, or the most value for their money, the greatest return on their investment, etc., etc. And all this leads to competitive thinking and behavior. Right? And just to return to the ranking thing. There's a phrase that Fitzpatrick uses when she talks about a disconnect between the very nice ethical uh, aims that universities like to present on their websites or their brochures or their advertising material, and when they talk to governments or they talk to media, the PR version of universities mission always has nice sounding things like serving the public, excellence in research, etc., etc., etc. And there's a disconnect between that messaging, the PR messaging, and the sort of messaging that may be in the that may be uh, being circulated in the dean's office, for instance. The kind of dean speak, and that messaging Fitzpatrick sums that up as chasing Harvard, right? And I find that very fascinating, very funny, and I think very insightful as well. Um, Now, of course, there's nothing against Harvard as an institution. I have not studied there, but I have spent a lot of time there on fellowship. So I know that it is an excellent place, as good, I'm sure, as any of the other great universities of the world. The point, however, in describing the standard university's mission, misguided mission, as chasing Harvard, is to say that why does everyone want to be Harvard? I mean, Harvard is good. It is probably the best, one of the best universities in the world, but it is doing something unique to its own history, to its own location, in geography, in society, in culture, and in the place that it is, right? Uh, it has emerged from a certain set of circumstances and it serves a certain kind of public. It performs a function unique to its origin and its existence. So it exists in a context. It serves a particular purpose. Every university can serve its own unique purpose. It can serve a public, right? And so uh, this speaks to this mad rush for uh, that number one spot on the NIRF rankings, for instance. Uh, I don't know which institute is India's number one, but I'm sure it's one of the IITs. Maybe it's IIT Madras. I don't know. But why would every other college or university want to be what that particular IIT is doing? It's absurd. Uh, every institute serves a very unique purpose. And this brings me to what I find to be probably um, Fitzpatrick's most powerful point, which he states very early in the book, in the introduction, is that Fitzpatrick brings about a conceptual shift in how we understand the existence and purpose of a university, right? It is common thinking to assume, it is commonly assumed that universities exist to teach people something intellectual, right? And it is commonly held that maybe the job of a university is to produce the best ways of knowing or thinking, right? And for Fitzpatrick, that is completely wrong, right? The university's goal is not to produce the best ways of thinking or knowing, or rather, is not to achieve excellence in any uh, mechanical or uh, weirdly absolute terms, but rather to teach people how to live in and with others. Right? This is I'm summarizing and paraphrasing Fitzpatrick. The quest for excellence. Right? If every university in the world was trying to be Harvard, right? They were trying to be excellent in some absolute metrics, right? Uh, in measured in numbers, right? Then that would be a perfect example of competitive thinking. However, if every university instead tried to do what Fitzpatrick defines as the true function and mission of university, which is to teach people how to live in and with others, then that would be a perfect example of generous thinking. Okay, I find that very powerful, and I think that we can learn this from Fitzpatrick's book. The best that a university can do is to enable people to create ways of understanding that are in line with their social and natural surroundings. Right. So that's a lot of conceptual bits. I'm now going to move to something a little bit a little bit practical. So um, despite having all of this, all the competitive thinking that Fitzpatrick describes, unfortunately, is very widespread, and the alternative to that is generous thinking. Fitzpatrick provides a few theoretical definitions of what generous thinking is, and generally speaking, it involves being humble, it involves being open to change, and it involves accepting that there will always be contexts in which we can be wrong, and that can be a very difficult lesson for a lot of academics to learn, because our professional and intellectual training, uh, up until the point when we earn our terminal degrees, that is the Doctor of Philosophy, which is required in most disciplines to enter the profession of teaching. Until that point, all of our training is designed to make us yearn for perfection, to yearn for excellence, and to make us more than a little paranoid of being wrong. And so I find it very revolutionary and very moving, and I'm very grateful to Fitzpatrick for writing this, that true generosity, or truly fulfilling one's uh, public goal as a functionary of the university, is to accept that we can be wrong, and that it's okay to be wrong. I find that I very strongly agree with this statement, and I think if we can admit to being wrong in public, if we can let go of this yearning for perfection, I think we can open ourselves up to many transformations, and just we can add so many dimensions to our growth as human beings, but also as professional scholars, teachers, and writers. So, right now, moving to some practical advice, and this comes mostly in chapters 2 and 3. That is the chapter titled "Reading" and the chapter titled "Public." I'll speak about reading because I find that very immediately relevant to my training and job. So, in the lives of literary critics, people who teach literature and write about literature as part of their living, in their everyday life, in their professional life, competitive thinking has a very pernicious but also very pervasive role. How is that? I spoke briefly about this hostile and aggressive stance, and that translates into a particular mode of writing about literature. In that mode, the writer is a scholar who has read a lot of theory, meaning a lot of scholarship written by historians, philosophers, sociologists, etc., etc., etc. And with that, armed with that knowledge, this scholar writes about a literary text and proceeds to extract meaning or truth that is hidden inside the literary text and which can be extracted only by this discerning, expert, theoretically informed reader, right? So, non-expert or readers who lack this professional training, who lack the knowledge of these theoretical texts, will not be able to extract that hidden truth. Now, this is a very crude and exaggerated summary. It makes scholarship look bad, but it's exaggerated for a purpose. It's exaggerated to illustrate a hidden kernel of truth, which is that the mode of writing, which is known as critique, often has a lot of bad influences. So, not only in relation to literary texts, but also in relation to other scholars, a literary critic and a writer can often appear very, very hostile and dominant. How does that work? So often, when responding to the work of other scholars, one scholar will scan their responses for weaknesses, for gaps, for flaws. And so, for instance, let me just give you an example. Let's say that I'm writing an article or a book on a play by Shakespeare. Before writing, before presenting my argument or what my interpretation of that play is, I'll read what other scholars have written about that play or about another text, for whatever I'm writing about. And I'll try to describe those writings as somehow inadequate or incomplete and insufficient. And then I will present my argument or my interpretation as somehow better, if not the best, then better, more persuasive, and more worthy of engagement by readers. Um, Now, this mode of reading has a lot of benefits. It helps to teach young scholars how to build an argument, how to engage in academic discourse, how to join scholarly communities, and how to build one's own position in a scholarly community. I certainly learned a lot from this kind of discourse, and I'm very grateful that I learned that style. However, in a context where there is already a growing suspicion about the kind of expert work that is done in, say, humanities or English literature departments, this kind of an approach, this kind of a critical approach, can have the exactly opposite consequence. And in Fitzpatrick words, critique or critical reading can look like pure negativity to non-expert readers outside the academy, right? And this is so what should literary scholars do, right? Literary scholars should pay attention to under theorized aspects of what they do as part of their jobs, right? uh, right now there exists a lot of uh, perceptions, a lot of stereotypes about the difference between the kinds of reading that is done by professionals inside the university and non professionals who care deeply for literature, who spend a lot of time reading about reading books, and also talking about their love for the books that they read, but who are not employed in universities and who don't have any professional stake in the university. Now, between these two groups, there are a lot of differences, and these two groups don't speak to each other. Fitzpatrick believes that that is a great loss, this lack of communication, and literary critics can fulfill the public facing mission of the university if they can build a bridge between these two groups, if they can initiate dialogues and if they can create a space in which these non-professional readers can join hands with professional readers and thereby support both the university and expand its very expert but until now somewhat isolated activities in the realm of research, right? So what can literary critics do? And so there are some aspects of these different kinds of reading that need to be broken up. So there's a perception that these two kinds of readings are different, and literary critics need to address those differences and make them less stark. So what are some of these differences? Probably the biggest difference has to do with the role of pleasure, right? Um, there is a perception that professional readers read books because they have a certain professional obligation, right? Sure, we may have joined this profession because we love reading, but in our professional life, we read books because we are either writing a review of a book, the book, or we are reading it to teach it, or we are reading it to publish an article in which we argue with other scholars about our interpretation of the book, right? Therefore, this all of this activity has very little of real pleasure in it. This is a perception, and contrary to this, the perception is that when non-professional readers engage with books, they do it for the sake of a pure, pleasurable engagement with the book. So they read books because they love reading. Now, this is the kind of stereotype. Both of these characterizations are unfair and unrealistic. And it is the onus is on the professional literary critic to communicate that these are in fact unfair and unrealistic characterizations. So to speak about the first one, uh, literary critics should make room for readings that do not sound academic, right? And they should also uh, talk about the kind of pleasure, pain, attraction, distaste, all of these emotions, all of these human and embodied emotions that are a very important part of professional reading and writing about literature. So that is one thing that literary critics should do more. Uh, Literary critics should also communicate to non-professional readers that when they engage with books, it is a very pure and simple engagement activity that is done for fulfillment and for pleasure. But that also has an unconscious or under theorized theoretical baggage to it, right? And this has to be done with some sensitivity, not to alienate these readers completely, or not to destroy their pleasure by making it sound academic, but to show that when someone says, for instance, that I love a book because I relate to its central character, for instance, if I say that I love a book because it speaks to a person's desire to have a home, right? That is not uh, a non-academic or a pre-theoretical or a simple-minded position. It may sound simple because it doesn't use a lot of academic and technical jargon, but there is a conversation waiting to happen there about how that very pure and simple attachment to literature can actually be the beginning of a theoretical and academic conversation about the meaning and value of reading, right? Now, another thing that literary critics must do is to acknowledge and not dismiss as naive the ways in which non-professional readers engage with literature. One common aspect of a lot of non-professional engagements with literature is that they break this kind of objective or academic distance between the reader and the text, right? They relate to characters a lot. They relate to the fictional world in a novel, for instance, and they often pick up aspects of books and use them as occasions for self-improvement, right? So for instance, someone can read the novels of the, the French novelist Balzac as a way of learning about the capitalist economy and just how to make money. So there are a lot of novels that describe romance or finance or other aspects of contemporary life, and a reader can be very easily forgiven for saying that they read a certain novel because they want to learn how to, I don't know, make friends, fall in love, earn more money, so and so. So these kinds of approaches, these kinds of motives for reading may appear naive, but they can actually be the beginning of a very meaningful conversation about why we read. So the thing that literary scholars should do is not dismiss these readings as naive. What else should literary scholars do? According to Fitzpatrick, scholars should focus more on what makes them human. And one of the most obvious things that make us human is that we are changed by our encounter with literature. Right? We know as researchers that the words on the page can change a person's life. We should write and we should teach, uh, always remembering that very simple but very powerful fact. Right? Finally, we should always remember that if we don't communicate why we love what we do in our jobs, then why will others care for the value of our jobs, right? Uh, we should talk publicly, honestly, accessibly, frequently, and in as many ways as possible about our love for reading and studying and teaching literature. We should talk more honestly about what moves us, what we find powerful, attractive, distasteful in our study of literature. We should do that because if we don't find ways to demonstrate what we love about our work, we will be forced to do our work in competitive and aggressive and often hostile ways, which I don't think is a very sustainable way to go about our lives. Uh, in subsequent chapter, this chapter 3, The Public, Fitzpatrick provides some examples in which examples of ways in which scholars can stage their journeys, their engagements, their painful, their pleasurable, their embodied, and their very personal stories of engaging with their primary objects and their methodologies in public ways and on public platforms. Um, and Fitzpatrick talks about how her second book and this book, Generous Thinking, were uploaded on public platforms for peer review before being published in this kind of a more traditional academic format. Now, of course, not everyone can do this kind of crowdsourced peer review, but it's a very powerful example of the kind of radical openness and the kind of very difficult choices that often or choices that may appear difficult to outsiders, but will not be so difficult if one follows through this whole idea of generous thinking as Fitzpatrick has described it. Um, uh, I I think generous thinking is very powerful, and Fitzpatrick's book is not just an occasion to theorize or to say things that sound good. I mean, what sounds better? I mean, what could sound better than saying that we should be generous thinkers. I mean, of course, nobody would admit to being ungenerous in their professional life, and especially uh, disciplines such as humanities, which are deeply concerned with ethics and morality. So Fitzpatrick is very aware that talking about doing good things is easy, but often very irresponsible and doesn't achieve much. So, uh, generous thinking is not about theorizing about generosity, but being fundamentally open to being changed uh, through one's encounter with others, and they can be non-expert, non-professional audiences who engage with the same objects that we study, but they could also be our own objects if we approach them with an unprecedented honesty. So, generosity in this view can be a difficult virtue to practice. In fact, if it is easy, then probably we're not doing it right, right? So, with that idea, I will stop, and I hope that this has been a useful introduction to what I think is a very important, powerful, and ultimately, I think for me personally, enjoyable book to read. Once again, I'll show you the cover of the book so you can um, try to get this book on your own. This is Generous Thinking by Kathleen Fitzpatrick. All right. Thank you for those of you who've stayed till the end. You've been very patient. I look forward to coming back here to talk about another book in a subsequent video. Thank you.